Your alternative talk radio contact, The Planet, KGRAradio.com.
With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
So on this edition of Into the Fray, I have on with me author June Gossler-Anderson, and on this round we are going to talk about her newly released and updated book, Hauntings and History of the Emerald Isle, and of course that is published through Jeff and I's Beyond the Fray Publishing. June, welcome to Into the Fray.
Well, thank you for having me, Shannon.
Love the book. I was very excited, as I said before we started the recording, that this book is right up my alley. And, you know, places overseas also have a special place in my heart because I was actually, and I don't remember it, but I was born in Lakenheath, England. So I don't remember it. I left there when I was around 2 to come to the States, Air Force brat. But, you know, anything in that area of the world is especially fascinating because simply the sheer age of things over there trumps anything that we have here. So before we get into some of these amazing stories and the history of a couple of these places, how did you even get into being interested in the world of the paranormal?
Oh, well, it's one of those things that just kind of came together from all different angles. Like you mentioned, the ghost tours. My husband died in 2007, and you're kind of faced with a crossroads. Okay, how do I live the rest of my life? And I decided to just start a new chapter and explore the things I was interested in. And Ghost Tours of Anoka, which is done by the Anoka Historical Society, as a fundraiser, was big on my list. So I volunteered to lead ghost tours. And Anoka, by the way, is the Halloween capital of the world, and it is haunted. And I kind of went into it, you know, with an interest. And as I led the tour and told the stories, I was hearing stories from people. And it's like, you know, I bet there's something to this. So I basically started my research with Anoka. In fact, I've published a book on history of Anoka and the story of the haunting of the Masonic Lodge in Anoka. And then in, what year? I've taught community ed classes, and one of the community ed directors clued me into the fact that Dave Schrader was going to be teaching a class on the paranormal in community ed, mind you. Well, I signed up, and his class was full. And it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, and he was talking about an Ireland tour. So I've traveled a lot because my son is in the Foreign Service, but he'd never been to England or Ireland or Scotland, and it was like, you know, I wish he'd go there because I speak the language. He's always in Russian-speaking places. So I realized I wasn't going to get there via my son. So when Dave started talking about a paranormal trip to Ireland, it was like, wow, you know, I've got a high interest in both of those. So I signed up. And this book is based on the trip that I took to Ireland with him, which, by the way, was the first of several trips that I've taken with his paranormal group. And we've got one that guess what? It's been postponed till June, but that will be to Scotland. That was my start, and it's just as as you start studying it or having more contacts, you learn more and more about it, and it's become fascinating.
So, is it safe to say that you have more books coming? As far as obviously the trips were postponed because of the COVID-19 situation we've got going on. But are you looking to do more books based upon your travels coming up?
Well, yeah. As I mentioned, I've done PowerPoint presentations for senior groups, and one of those that I put together is Tracking Dracula. And first part is based on a paranormal trip I took to Ireland and then a couple years later to England. And it revolves around Bram Stoker, who, as we know, wrote Dracula. And some of the places in Ireland that influenced him, he was Irish born. And then when we were in England, we were in Whitby, England, which is home of a beautiful monastery. And it's ruined, of course, but this is where he wrote Dracula and where in his book Dracula actually comes ashore. And then 2 years ago, we went to Romania and visited the castles there, a lot of interesting places. And when I came home, I did a lot of research on Vlad Tepes, otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler. And this is a character the real life historical figure that Bram Stoker based his Dracula on. And I put the two together in the talk, and now I'm working on developing it into a book by the same name.
Well, I already told you how excited I am about that. The Tracking Dracula book. I love that. So, June, let me ask you just your personal opinion. You've got Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then it was, of course, made into a movie starring Keanu Reeves and Anthony Hopkins. What's your feeling on that movie? Do you enjoy that movie, or do you think that it didn't do justice to the book?
So, I have to admit, I don't think I saw it.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it's something I bring up because it's very polarizing, that movie. Either people love it or they think it's just kind of garbage and go read the book and save yourself the trouble kind of a thing,
Well, the book is kind of a hard read because it was written in 1897.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the language, or some of it is a little oblique, but actually there have been about 200 movies made of Dracula,
mm-hmm.
and many more books written. Our high school staged a production of Dracula once, and I think the most memorable thing was where Dracula plucked a young girl out of the audience and carried her up to the stage. She was his next victim, and people in the audience, some of them thought that was just terrible, and of course she was a plant. There's been a lot of fun with the play Dracula, and some of them have been downright terrifying.
That's interesting that you brought that up. It reminds me of a scene from Interview with a Vampire when Antonio Banderas, so she wasn't plucked out of the audience, but they brought her out from backstage. Mm-hmm. And then there was the slew of vampires that did as they wanted with her on stage. But I think that the lore of the vampire is just extremely fascinating. And of course, Vlad the Impaler, he had just such a propensity for violence and these long, slow, torturous deaths. So it goes hand in hand with, I suppose, what Bram Stoker was looking for as far as a lead character. Well,
yeah, vampires were becoming quite popular in fiction at the time he was writing. And he was trying to develop a story on vampires. And when he got to Whitby, he did some research into Vlad, and it came together. He had his characters upon whom he would base it. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't have wanted to have been living in the 15th century when Vlad the Impaler was freed Wallachia in Transylvania, from Hungary on to the north and the Ottoman Empire on the south, because his methods were pretty intimidating. And I think, what is it, he's responsible for the deaths of 180,000. Sometimes I get my decimal points mixed, but he murdered, terrible deaths, a lot of people. And Dracula really doesn't hold a candle to him.
No, not at all. And he never seemed to tire of it. Like, that was just his, that was his happy place, is to make people suffer and to have these torturous means to end their life. And it was almost never a quick death from what we're reading about him.
No. Well, I read a bit about impaling, and it's just, oh my gosh,
Goodness. That's why
I don't even want to go into that.
Yeah. If one is so inclined to learn more about that, just go look up Vlad the Impaler and impaling in and of itself, and you will cringe and writhe in your seat just reading about that. So, well,
it was, on the presentation for the seniors, I thought, oh my gosh, I've really got to temper this down.
Yeah, because I mean, but then, during your talks, there's probably at least one inquisitive person that goes, "Can you go more in depth on impaling?" And I mean, do you regale them with the story and describe that, or you just say, let's save that for another time?
I haven't gotten to that. I had those that were scheduled. I just developed the talk, and those that have been scheduled for it, guess what's happened?
Yeah.
They've canceled. So I've been happy to have this project to work on, because the talks are, the seniors just, the buildings aren't open for anyone. So I'm going to have to put that on hold. When the time comes, I'll get back to it.
Yeah, I will be interested to hear those stories when they hear all of these, the details that you try to glance over, and if they try to take you back to those details, I'll be contacting you and going, "How'd that go, June?"
I really don't anticipate too much on that, but I'll be prepared if they do.
Yeah. Maybe a secondary mini paragraph to where hopefully you don't go into the details of the body's own weight and what it does to oneself. And anyway. Well, let's move on from that.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, that's okay. June, what were you going to say?
Oh, well, one of the trips we took was Germany and the Czech Republic, and it was a trail of terror. It wasn't so much haunting as the dark underbelly of European history, especially during the religious wars. And one of the places we visited was a torture museum. And there are some pretty graphic descriptions of various devices and methods there. So, but I much prefer Hauntings. They're more mystical.
Right. A little less blood most of the time, too. Blood and gore is toned down slightly. And before we get into some of these places, and by the way, folks, we're going to cover 3 different locations from Hauntings and history of the Emerald Isle. And I'll give a list before we hang up on the call of the other places that we're not going to touch on, so that you guys have plenty more to discover when you get the book. But I just wanted to preface this by saying that, yes, there is some history, because I think, the history is also important to attach to some of these stories, because a lot of the times that may be why it's having the activity it is. And so that is, of course, the history is in there, but also the hauntings. And June does a very good job of describing the when, the how, the where, and the why, the possible why, at least, right? And that varies from rituals to heartbreak to just plain old, just mean people. And it sometimes creates a haunting type situation. Well, June, how about we start at the Muckross Abbey? It's a perfect segue, because we were just talking about Bram Stoker and Dracula, and this place may have inspired some other things about for Bram Stoker and his Dracula. So let's dive into the Abbey.
Okay, and actually it did, but I don't dwell. I just mention it briefly in the book. I'll expand more on it in Tracking Dracula. I was mentioning I have been doing a talk on Ireland, and I actually slanted it around St. Patrick's Day. So I started with St. Patrick. He was a real person, and he did not drive the snakes out of Ireland because there weren't any there, but he did bring Christianity to the Irish, and he and his successor, who was St. Columbo, founded abbeys throughout Ireland. And actually, during the Dark Ages, Ireland was the light of the world. While Europe was being overrun by the hordes, Ireland was a pretty safe place, and a lot of the religious people went there. And it was they basically, I'm grasping for words here.
That's okay.
But monasteries were established all over Ireland, and the original Muckross Abbey was one of them. This was the Benedictine Abbey that was founded in the 5th century, and they were pretty much the center of community life. And the Benedictines educated the children, and they had the farming and the economy and all of that. They were very hospitable to visitors. Unfortunately, well, they did exist for about 4 centuries, but then came the Vikings, and they loved to raid the abbeys because they had treasure. So Muckross was destroyed by the Vikings in the 9th century, and it just kind of laid there. Well, then, after the Norman invasion of England, they also came to Ireland. I think it was about 1099. And with it, they brought new monastic orders. Among them were the Franciscans, who built another abbey at this site that is the ruins, the present-day ruins of Muckross Abbey. This was, of course, these abbeys were all Catholics. Well, this is where the history, well, it's all history, which I find intriguing.
Right.
But when King Henry VIII came to the throne, he had a dispute with the Pope about getting remarried quite a few times. And the Pope said no, and King Henry said, well, if you won't let me do it, I'll start my own church. And so he threw out the Roman Catholic Church, established the Church of England with himself as the head. And in those times, this is a theocracy where the government is the head of the church as well as the head of the nation. And an individual's passage to heaven, they needed the intermediaries. And in the Catholic Church, it was through the Pope. And then the king was secondary to the Pope. This is ruling by divine right, the divine rule of kings. So when Henry was excommunicated then by the Pope, all his subjects were subject to hell because that's where Henry was going.
Mm-hmm.
But so then Henry set up his own church, and then he was the head of the church, and he had the direct link to God, and which gave him a lot more power, of course. And he was trying to bring the Irish into this realm, as well as the rest of the British Isles, England and Scotland. The Irish did not give in to him. I mean, they fought him. They never were conquered religiously by England, although they suffered a great deal. They were basically disenfranchised from their land. Well, anyways, that's getting kind of beyond it. But Muckross Abbey was doing fine under the Franciscans. And then came Henry VIII. The English Reformation was 1534. When Elizabeth came in, she was a daughter of Henry VIII and his successor eventually. The soldiers went in to take care of the monasteries, and basically that meant destroying them and plundering their treasure. So there's a story there about the monks at Muckross Abbey. When the army was coming, they fled to an island in the lake and brought their treasure with, which would have been their silver chalices and that. And they secured them, buried them in a place. 2 monks were left behind to guard the monastery. The British soldiers were going to get the secret of where the treasure was hidden from them. They refused to give it up. So they, speaking of torture, they had a device called the iron boot. And it looked kind of like a cast iron cooking pot, but it was boot-shaped. And they would fill it with oil and put the poor victim's foot in it and put it over a bed of hot coals and just kind of slow roast their foot. So they basically tortured the monks to death, but they never did give up the treasure. And of course, their ghosts are still there guarding the treasure. And then things got worse when Cromwell came in. He instilled the penal code, and they were destroyed. Well, the edict went out that all Catholic monks and priests had to leave the country or suffer the consequences. And so some of them fled to France. Those that were left behind were murdered in some pretty horrible ways. They were hung, they were drawn and quartered, they were, I don't know, they had some really bad ways of awful ways of disposing of people back in those days.
They came up with some pretty incredibly horrific ways to kill people. The ingenuity there it blows your mind. I don't, the iron boot, I was not familiar with that one until you, and I've heard of a lot of different ways of torture. That's pretty dang horrible.
Yeah, right. I just think back sometimes, and it must have been an awful time to have lived one of your previous lives.
Yeah.
Hopefully you just survived it. Maybe you didn't.
Yeah, you want to be, if you're of one that believes in past lives and reincarnation and things, try to be good now, as good as you can, because you don't want to end up back there and then end up being drawn and quartered or any of these other wonderful things that they thought of doing to you.
Yeah, right. And if, it's to set examples. And actually, some of these were just great sport to watch. You think back to the Roman games in the Colosseum. I mean, that was their entertainment, blood sport.
Yeah.
And it seems to have it's a propensity of mankind.
June, I think one of the worst ones that I know of would be where they put the rats under the container, and then they heat the container up and it's over your stomach. And then, of course, rats can burrow and chew and dig and right inside of you to get away from the heat. Terrible.
Yeah, I don't know, they were ingenious. And it really boggles the mind. And you think that we've become more humane, and we have in some ways. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we will ever change human nature.
Right.
So, anyways, that's kind of the history of Muckross Abbey. We went there one night, and all of these things, I just kind of hit blind. It's like, oh, where are we going? I've never heard of this place. And so it was one evening in our group. There were about 40 of us in the group with Dave. You know Dave Schrader?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dave's a good friend. In fact, we actually lived in the same county until he moved south of Minneapolis after he married.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, I took the class from him. But there were about 40 of us, and we took a bus to, it was at night. We got out in this field, and we kind of walked through it to a marshy spot on the shore of a lake. We were told that there we might be able to see orbs there, that it was noted for orbs over its presence. Well, looking back, this is the lake that the monks fled over to bury their treasure. So if orbs are their spirit energy, that's where they'd be. So we watched. We didn't see any orbs. We started walking down a wooded path, and in the moonlight, we saw this hulking building before us, and it was the ruins of the monastery. And so we went in, and we explored around a bit, and in the center of it was a courtyard. And in the center of the courtyard grows a yew tree. It's still there. Now, these trees are ancient. And in fact, in the story of Robin Hood, you might remember their bows were made from yew wood.
Mm-hmm.
It had special properties. The tree is thought to be as old as the Abbey. And they're planted very often in graveyards. And they would ward off evil spirits, and they could help spirits find the afterlife. But the one unique property of the yew tree is that if you cut it, the sap bleeds red, and it's thought to be the blood of Christ in the tree. And the tree, if you touch the tree, if you touch the sap, you are cursed, and you will be dead within a year. So much to our horror, one of the men in our group leaped over the wall into the courtyard and gasped, put his hand on the yew tree. And it's like, oh my gosh, what did we do? Well, our next trip was to Germany and the Czech Republic the next year, and he wasn't on the trip. And I thought, oh dear, what happened to him? Well, the next year we went to England, and he was on the trip. So I asked him, what did you hear? How have things been for you? Because, he said, I never felt better in my life. So that's kind of debunked.
Yeah. So at least for him, he survived the touching of the yew tree, right?
He survived, right. And then around the Abbey is a cloister. It's kind of like an arcade, and so we all went in there, and we stayed very still to see if we could hear voices or footprints, or footsteps or whatever. And really, for 40 people, we were pretty quiet. And so we stood there very quietly for a length of time. We didn't hear anything. So then we went out the entrance, which goes into an ancient graveyard. Stones are tipping every which way, but they're still burying people there, and some rather famous people are buried there, some poets and that. And they think that, I'll tell this story in my next book about the corpse in the graveyard in Bram Stoker. But as we went out, Eric Fossum and Dave Schrader were the last ones out, and they said they heard distinct footsteps behind them as they left. So maybe we were being observed. But it was a fascinating place, and when I got home, that's when I really delved into the history and found so much that connected there. They must have been magnificent in their time.
I mean, as far as the buildings themselves, like you said, when you saw the shape of this building off in the distance, this hulking shape, it just must inspire such awe and wonder, just even the fact of it being built way back then, and them being able to execute that kind of a task.
Right, and just some of the beauty of it, the Gothic windows, the arched windows, and the stonework, and the design even. These people were not primitive stone builders.
Right.
I mean, there's real craftsmanship that went into these buildings. But of course, this is, for much of the Christian era, the most magnificent buildings and paintings and art and music has all been for religious purposes.
And I want to mention to everybody that there are gorgeous color photos all throughout June's book, including maps of where all of these places are and everything. So that helps you along your journey, should you ever take one in Ireland and follow the footsteps of these guys. June, do you mind telling the story about Drake, the hermit monk, and what he was up to and that whole portion of that story?
Well, it's just kind of anecdotal. Drake was a hermit monk who, they're always doing pious things to prove their love for God and that. And so Drake slept inside a coffin in the Abbey for 11 years. And that's all I know about him.
So he was trying to do that to prove his devotion and love to God.
That generally would be the reason.
Yeah.
Yes. So kind of bizarre ways of doing it, but to each his own.
Yeah, bless his heart. And he probably was of the mind. I mean, if he's sleeping in a coffin, he's probably doing the whole, well, I haven't eaten in a year, and, I drink from the yew tree in the courtyard, and I'm still here, but I happen to sleep in the coffin. I mean, my goodness. I mean, the
Well, it was deprivation that proved your love for God.
Right.
Self-sacrifice.
That's quite the devotion. Now, was he supposed to be one of the two monks left behind, or was that going on when the rest of them were there? Do we know that information?
Kind of a disconnected story.
Yeah. A
lot of just kind of anecdotal, and some of them I've kind of put together with, okay, this must have happened. This is where the history comes in. Okay, this would have happened during this time period. And I'm not a historian, but I could be off base with it. But for me, putting two and two together, well, this makes sense. Now, I would suspect that Drake preceded the English Reformation, during their good times.
Yeah, I would hope that he would get the stamp of approval and not be sent back to redo horrible things or get impaled by Vlad or anything like that. It seems like he did the right thing to avoid that situation.
Yeah. Now you're bringing Vlad the Impaler into it. My goodness.
I mean, if these things are supposed to stick around, maybe, of course, it's just like talking about Robert the Doll, like you kind of have to say, with all due respect, Robert or Vlad or whomever we're talking about you very respectfully and no harm done, no harm, no foul. Don't come after me.
One of the things you learn if you do an investigation, be respectful. Yep. You are in territory. You are their guest. And those that go in and start, how show yourself now, and being rude and obnoxious, that's not the way you handle hauntings and ghosts and that. You're respectful.
So there may be some ghost shows that you may not be a big fan of then. Am I getting that right? Just saying.
I am. It's the macho spirit that takes over.
Yeah. Well, let's take a trip over to Leap Castle. This place is filled with history and stories.
Oh, I loved it. And actually, it's pronounced Lep.
Oh. See, I learn something every time I get on. Lep Castle. There we go.
Well, and it came about, it was built about the 1200s by the O'Bannon clan. And there were two brothers who were vying for chieftainship of the clan and also to build the castle. And so apparently there was something to jump over. and so the challenge was whoever was able to leap over this, whatever it was, I don't know if it was a chasm or what, would be the chief of the clan and build the castle. And so the surviving brother built the castle. And for that reason, it's called Lep of the O'Bannons in Gaelic, which I'm not versed in at all. But so from that, it took the name Lep Castle. Well, the O'Bannons were a minor clan or tribe. The powerful ones, the powerful Irish princes, were the O'Carrolls. And the castle was taken over, I don't know by what means, but by the O'Carrolls, and their chief was Mulroney O'Carroll. When he died in 1532, he had two sons, Teague, one-eyed O'Carroll, and Thaddeus, who was a priest, who were both vying for to be leader of the clan, leader of the O'Carrolls. And it was a pretty fierce rivalry. Well, Teague O'Carroll settled it when Thaddeus was saying mass one day in the bloody chapel, and Teague plunged his sword through him and killed him and became leader of the clan. And ever since then, it has been called the Bloody Chapel. So the O'Carrolls were a pretty, blood sport was their game, and Teague was really good at it. To sharpen their skills, they hired a neighboring clan, the McMahons, to teach them more about the art of warfare. And they did a good job, because when they went into battle with another clan, they were able to defeat them. So Teague had invited them to their victory dinner, and I think he was going to pay them there. But instead of rewarding them favorably, he drugged their drinks and carried them up to be cast down the oblique, or the oubliette. Now, oubliette was in the Bloody Chapel, and when you go up there, it looks kind of like a water closet, with a raised hole in it. But actually, it is a shaft that leads 3 stories down to the bottom, on which is stuck a sharp spike. And prisoners would be thrown down the oubliette, and if they were fortunate, they were killed on the spike, and if they were not fortunate, they were wounded, and they would lay there forgotten, which is what the word oubliette means, and they would die of their wounds, starvation, whatever. It was a horrible way to die. So this is how he rewarded the McMahon clan, by throwing them down the oubliette. In later years, and this again, I kind of surmise, they told about, I think it was like Scottish mercenaries during the time of Cromwell, who were laying siege to the castle, and they were unsuccessful. And the prisoners, the Scottish mercenaries, were also thrown down the oubliette. And the later excavation, they dragged out 3 cartloads of bones of people who had died in the oubliette. Trying to see if I could remember how many individuals that was. I'm not coming across that figure now, but it was many, many individuals who had died in there. And interestingly enough, among the bones, they found a gold watch dated 1830. So who was the last thrown down there?
Yeah, and actually, I found it here. It looks like you wrote down 150 individuals found on the grounds in the oubliette.
Yeah, and it was 3 cartloads. And that excavation came much later, after basically, I think after the castle was destroyed, and there were some restoration. Again, they were a little oblique about dates or time periods on that. So the O'Carrolls ruled over the castle and over the territory. They were the powerful lords there. And but then they were getting a lot of pressure from the English, who were trying to take over. Finally, with Cromwell, they lost the castle, but some immigrated. And this is an interesting footnote on American history. The first immigrant was called Charles Carroll the Settler, and he settled in Maryland. They dropped the O from the name O'Carroll, but he had two descendants. Among them was Charles of Carrollton, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a survivor who signed the Declaration, and because he was Catholic, they think that that's why that phrase "freedom of religion" was put into one of the reasons it was put into the Bill of Rights. There are other reasons having to do with religious wars raging in Europe and in Ireland at that time. And the other one was John Carroll, who was the first ordained Catholic bishop in the United States, and he founded Georgetown University. And if you go out east, many counties in that area are named Carroll County. I think I've got the number in the book. And these are after Charles Carrollton, who had quite an impact on American history. And if you tour that section of Ireland, Offaly, County Offaly, Ireland, there's a lot of evidence of O'Carroll's there. There's O'Carroll stores and so on. I was back a few years later and I noticed it then. But after the O'Carrolls left, there's a really neat story about Jonathan Darby, who actually the second, who inherited the castle. And the first story tells that he was a prisoner in the castle, and one of the O'Carroll daughters fell in love with him and brought him food and thought of his survival. One day she attempted to smuggle him out of the dungeon and encountered her brother. And the two had a sword fight, and Darby slew her brother and married the sister and became lord of the castle. Well, it's a nice story, but, how did he escape the spike at the bottom of the oubliette? Where did he get the sword? So the more common story is that Jonathan O'Darby was given the castle by Cromwell in payment for his services. And so he took over. He had a son who was known as the Wild Captain. This was Jonathan Darby III. And he had amassed quite a treasure, probably plundering. And he, with the help of his servants, he buried it on the property. But he wanted to keep the place that the treasure had been buried or secreted a secret, so he murdered the servants. Well, he was captured by the Irish. He was an Englishman, the Darbys were English. He was captured by the Irish and imprisoned, and he was sentenced to be hanged and drawn and quartered, but they didn't carry it out right away. And in the meantime, he languished in prison for many years and went mad. He was freed when the English gained ascendancy. I believe it was William of Orange, and he went back to Leap Castle with the intention of finding his treasure, but he couldn't remember where he'd buried it. And unfortunately, he had murdered the eyewitnesses. Well, if we go forward a few generations, the last O'Darby was, again, a Jonathan O'Darby who inherited the castle from his grandfather in 1880. And he was not a nice person. He married an Englishwoman, Mildred Dill, in 1889, and I think she was quite a nice person. She was a woman ahead of her time. She was an aspiring writer. She had literary aspirations, but her parents' religion frowned upon it. It was unseemly for a woman. So they married her off, made a good match for her to Jonathan Darby. She was 20 and he was 35. As a wedding present, he enlarged Leap Castle, sold off the lands, and raised the rents on the tenants, which did not endear him to the local population. He was not a nice man. He had a terrible temper. They had 4 children. The children feared him. But fortunately, he was gone a lot of the time. Well, this led Mildred, who had an interest in the occult, to kind of pursue her interests. And she would hold seances at Leap Castle. And she wrote Gothic novels under the name of Andrew Mary, because if her husband found out, she'd be in big trouble. And actually, the books had quite a masculine voice to them. She also wrote one that was very sympathetic to the Irish, the plight of the Irish, under the name of Andrew Mary. So they think that Mildred's dabbling in the occult released an elemental, which is an earth spirit that was probably placed there by the Druids back when this was their sacred ground. And they think possibly the spirits coalesced into this manifestation that Mildred describes seeing, and other people claim they had seen it, but Mildred gives this description, which is in the book of this, I think you read the description, just this nauseous, foul-smelling creature about the size of a sheep with sunken eyes and pretty disgusting. So one day, John, I think the year was actually 1915, if I've got it right. Jonathan was home and he encountered the creature. And his reaction was that Mildred had dressed one of the servants up to make a fool of him. And he cursed and ranted and raved at her. In time, the winds were changing. There was a rising in 1922, and this is when the castle burned. Well, Jonathan Darby was aware of the trouble was brewing. So in 1921, he moved his family and his belongings back to England, where they would be safe. Mildred's manuscripts stayed locked in a cabinet in the castle. And in 1922, the people rose up, and of course, the way to show your displeasure with the English is to burn the castles that they were living in. It's kind of like the riots happen now, you know. We'll burn our neighborhood and show everybody. So on one fine day in 1922, the castle was empty except for the caretaker. The village people came and they burned and bombed the castle and made a big mess of it. Well, the castle, was locked up. The ruins were padlocked and just remained ruins for about 70 years after. But people passing by would claim that they could see flashes of light, like 1,000 candles, lighting up in the bloody chapel. And they believed it was the spirits of those who had met their death at the castle. And then in 1979, Peter Bartlett, who was a descendant of the O'Bannons, bought the castle and decided to restore it. But first he had to rid it of the spirits that were there. So he brought in a white witch from Mexico. And she spent a lot of time in the Bloody Chapel. And she came out of it saying, well, the spirits they want to stay, but they'll be good. So they're still there.
That's very comforting, isn't it? We're going to stay,
yeah.
but we'll behave, but we're not going to leave.
Right, yeah. So, they promised to behave themselves. And, that's their home, so why not? So Peter worked on the restoration until he died in 1989. And then it was bought by Sean Ryan, who is the present owner of the castle. And he was our host when we visited it. And he's a charming man. He is a musician. He is a concert-level tin pipe player. He plays concerts on the continent and in America, and he played for us. And it's just wonderful. And his wife was an Irish step dancer, and she still judges contests. So Sean, who's a pretty burly man, started work on the restoration. He ran into some problems, like his tools would be moved out of reach, got knocked off the ladder a couple of times, broke his kneecap, put out of commission every once in a while, but he persevered, and he got a roof on the Bloody Chapel. And in 1991, they christened their baby daughter in the Bloody Chapel, which I think took care of the rest of the evil spirits. So they have lived there ever since, and they've hosted the place, visitors to the place. It's known as the most haunted castle in Ireland. And he says there's, still a few ghosts around. He'll see them occasionally, but they all live happily ever after there. And as we were leaving the castle, one of the members of our group took a parting shot. And there, and this is in the book, in the window just below the Bloody Chapel, it looks like there's a priest looking out at us, watching us leave.
That's so cool. And you guys didn't see that until after the pictures were developed, correct?
Right. And, a lot of this, for me, comes together after.
Yeah.
Okay, what did I just see? And then I start the research. And combine the research with my experiences there. It just paints a really nice picture for me. I'm debating, I'm going, this trip to Scotland. Now, should I really research these places before I go? I guess that would be the smart thing to do. But it's so much more fascinating to find out where I was after I've been there.
I don't know. It's kind of a neat way to do things because maybe it leaves your mind more open and it's a more true way to experience something. I don't know. Or maybe it might be good to research. Yeah, I don't know which way I'd go on that one.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of debating, and it depends on how ambitious I am before I go.
Right,
too,
right.
So.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of research. These places have a long list of history bullet points to go through. So, June, a couple questions about this place. When the new owners, the current owners, took it over, how much of the original castle actually was still there? Was it just a shell? Was it, were some of the walls torn down? What did it look like when they took hold of it?
Well, when the castle was originally built, it was the keep, which is the central part. It's a square 3-story building, which is where they lived. And the Darby's expanded like wings on either side. The wings are still in ruins, but Peter and Sean have restored the keep. The keep, they live in it, and it's quite nice. I actually have a picture or two of it in my book, and it's furnished appropriately. We just saw the main part. We didn't see the sleeping quarters or anything. And from the keep, there's a spiral staircase, stone staircase, that you go up to the Bloody Chapel. And it's pretty treacherous. You hang on. And offside the spiral staircase are some bedrooms of some sort that people apparently slept in. They look a little weird, but they were bedrooms. So the Bloody Chapel is just basically for people exploring. It still has the oubliette in it. The bloody altar is raised above it, and it's a very high ceiling in it, but that's, I think, more for show than for living in. But they live quite comfortably in the castle. And I asked him, I said, well, how do you finance all of this? Well, that's when I found out that he was a musician and financed it through his concerts.
Wow. I mean, to be able to own a castle, I hazard to say that a lot of people are quite jealous of that. I know I certainly am. How fascinating to own a castle out there.
Well, actually, most of the castles in Ireland are ruined. They suffered quite a bit during that uprising of 1920 because the Irish basically blew up their heritage to get even with the English.
Yeah. I don't know. I still think it'd be worth it, and do what they did and try to restore it the best you could. And if not, hey, at least you still own an incredible part of history out there. Now, yeah. A question, because you've got a shot in the book of the oubliette itself and peering down, of course, into it. Obviously, they removed the spikes, right? Is that portion of the castle said to be one of the most haunted? When these groups go in there, from you guys to others, are they getting EVPs? Are they seeing orbs? Are they seeing apparitions in one part or the other more so?
I don't know. There's one picture I saw, and that was during my research, that had a shadow on the wall, supposedly, of the priest. What pictures I have in my book shows it looks like, oh my gosh, all these orbs, but it's actually dust in there that reflects off the light of the camera. And orbs, dust is very often mistaken for orbs. So it's a good question, but I can't answer it. I believe that Sean, one of the phantoms or ghosts he saw, was sitting by his fireplace.
No, and I just want to say, because you do have that picture where at first glance someone might go, look at all the orbs. And I appreciate the fact that you say, no, it's dust. Like it's captioned, this is dust. And I appreciate that. And I've got my phone open here. And I got to say, the picture and it really does look like a priest in robes staring out the window. It is incredible.
Yeah, that's me. I didn't come upon that until later. One of the gals on a later trip said she had that. I said, oh, send it to me. And the pictures, I took a lot of pictures on my iPad, and then I lost it.
Oh, no, that's terrible.
I know. I put a call out to the people in the group, and they were really good about responding with their pictures.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of representation from those that were in the group, including some of their stories.
Well, maybe that worked out, for a reason then, so that you could get in contact with them again and, like you said, get their stories. June, and I'm not trying to lead anyone down a path or anything, but to me, it almost looks like this figure is holding a book.
Yeah, it does.
That's an incredible shot. No, yeah, thank you for talking about that, because that castle in and of itself, that was one that stood out to me, and thank you for talking about it. I'm glad that we covered that. Well, let's jump to our last location, which will tie into, of course, a question that everyone wants me to ask you, and that is, have you had any personal experiences, of course, at any of these places? So let's go to our last location here in the book that we're going to talk about.
So, okay, I got asked that a lot on Ghost Tours. Have you ever seen a ghost? And I've said no, but I've met a lot of people who have. So, this was Enniscorthy Castle, which is in Wexford, England. And one of the neat things about traveling with Dave on these is that we're not part of a large tour group. We have our own. They make arrangements for us to go explore on our own, and we are the only group there. And so we were hosted by the Wexford Paranormal Society to visit Enniscorthy Castle, which is in Wexford, Ireland, which is on, it's just kind of south of Dublin on the east coast. This castle was built, it's called a tower castle. The keep is in the middle, and there are 4 towers on each corner. It's a Norman castle. It was built by Gerald of Pendergast in 1190, and his family lived there for 300 years. And eventually, again with the Reformation, it became the property of the English crown in the early 1530s. And there was some political scandal, I guess, involving those who occupied it for a while. Some people who got in trouble with the king who lived there were punished, and so on. In the year that my history goes back to, the pivotal year is 1798, when there was a rise, and there were many risings in Ireland as the Irish were trying to throw off their English lords and masters. And there was one in Wexford, and the remarkable thing about it was that the Irishmen were able to hold off the English for a month. And this was pitting Irish pikemen against English muskets. And the Irish were holed up on Vinegar Hill, which is opposite the castle. The English were in the castle. And when they were finally overthrown, many of them escaped through a gap in the English lines. And those that didn't were rounded up and thrown into the dungeon below Enniscorthy Castle. Well, this dungeon was horrible as it may seem. It was not as bad as the oubliette. We were down there, and it's hewn out of the rock. The floors are uneven. In fact, I tried to stand and brace myself against a wall, and I'm sliding down the slope. They're not a real comfortable place to be. But we were brought up to the living quarters of the castle, and it had been occupied by an English family, the De Roche family, until 1954, when it became a museum. And they've done a really good job of preserving this part of the history. So after our orientation, we were divided into 4 groups. And we were in the main living room, and the first thing they did was roll up the rug. I mean, are we going to dance or what? Well, our group stayed in that room, and we were working with the tilting table. And, you know, have you got a wooden TV tray? They're real common now.
Actually, I do, yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody has it. Well, this is what was there. Well, the tray was placed on the wooden floor. The lights were out, but there was a light shining under the tray. We could see that there wasn't anything attached to it. And we were instructed to place our fingers, to gather around the TV table, and place our fingers lightly on the top, which we did. And our guide in there from the Wexford Society was talking to the ghost and said, well, if you're here, let us know. And the table began rocking, just gently. And we were not doing it. There was no way we could do it. And she talked to it, and it rocked a little more. And we were pretty impressed, but she said, she wasn't that impressed, that sometimes it actually rocks down to the floor and back again. And she said she thought it was the ghost of it was either John or Andrew, who are kind of the resident ghosts there. And she said they don't like each other, and we found out why as we went through the castle. So our next stop, we went into a room. It was a dark room again. It had a rough wooden table, and on the table was just like a plain low glass with a votive under it. And this was a divining light. The room was dark, and Eric and Dave had gone ahead, and they had checked the room and under the table. I mean, they checked it pretty thoroughly for any devices that might be there. And it was clean. There was nothing there. So we started asking questions of the divining tool. And we found out, to be oriented, a downward flash of the glass. We had our fingers placed lightly on top, just like with a tilting table.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody could actually move the glass by themselves. And so we were instructed that a horizontal splash meant yes, and a downward meant no. So we could ask yes or no questions, but it would also spell out answers. We started asking questions, what is your name? And the glass spelled out Andrew. And when did you die? In 1798 is what it spelled out, and that was the year of the rising when the Irish pikemen held off the British musketeers. How old were you when you died? And the glass spelled out 23. Were you an Irishman? And the glass said yes. Were you captured? And again, it said yes. Then what happened? And the glass spelled out dungeon. How long were you there? 6 months. Were you married? A slash, no. Did you have a sweetheart? Yes, and we learned that she later married. Did you live in Wexford? And the answer was no. And where did you live? And the glass spelled out 5 miles. And then we tried to find out its profession. And, you're thinking back 300 years, okay, what did people do in those times? Okay, farmer? No. Cooper? No. Blacksmith? No. All the trades and occupations we could think of that were relevant at that time. And then somebody said soldier, and bingo, that was it. Did you kill anybody? No. And we kind of ran out of questions at that time, but we learned from another group that John, who was in the tilting table room, had been one of the jailers, and that Andrew had actually been killed by a bayonet to the throat. But John was not the one who killed him. Well, one of my friends, Faye, was with a group that was in the tilting table room while we were with the divining glass. And Faye told me this story after that was just like, oh my gosh. One of the women in that group was a very attractive blonde, and apparently John was turned on with her. So when they placed their fingers on the tilting table, it not only rocked like it did for us, it rocked all the way to the floor and back. And then it started chasing the blonde girl.
Oh, my.
The table was moving after her, and she's trying to get away from it. And all these people with their fingers on the table are trying to keep up with it. And it cornered her against the couch. And then Faye suggested that she enticed it back into the living room, and things calmed down there. But that was one lively spirit. Our third group we went up to one of the towers, and we had a Frank's box. And are you familiar with the Frank's box?
I am, but just describe it quickly for those that may not be familiar with it.
Well, it was invented by a man whose name was Frank. And his theory was that when you tune in a radio, you know how you get all the static between stations? And that this is where a ghost voice will come in between these bands. And so a Frank box keeps switching stations or bands all the time quite rapidly. And once in a while, you will catch a word. And this is supposedly from one of the spirits who's trying to communicate. The thing is, you need to make sure that it's a spirit. You need to ask it the same question several times and see if you get the same answer. So we went up on the parapet with the Frank's box, which would be a good place to wing a passing spirit. But the traffic below was pretty noisy. And if there had been anything, we wouldn't have heard it. So then we went down to the dungeon to try out the Frank's box there. And when we were going down there, the group that was just coming up from the dungeon was laughing like mad, and they were teasing one of their members. This was Jeff. And Jeff said, "No, I didn't do it. I didn't do it." "Yes, you did, Jeff." Spirit Frank's box said, "Yes." "No, I didn't do it." Well, come to find out, the spirit box, or Frank's box, had accused Jeff of making a rude noise, if you want to.
He's busted.
Yeah, and just, I didn't do it. And so when we went down there, we put the Frank's box on the floor, and the first thing that was asked was, I'm trying to think how it was worded. When the last group was here, somebody made an indiscreet voice. Who was it? And the voice in the Frank's box said, "Jeff." And it said it, "Jeff, Jeff, Jeff," several times.
Oh my gosh.
And so then that was the end of our adventures there. And the Wexford Paranormal Group had some food prepared for us, and we kind of debriefed while we ate. And Jeff still insisted it wasn't him. So,
nothing like being called out and busted by a spirit, when you're trying to be very stealthy about a certain thing and you just can't do it if the ghost tells on you.
Well, yeah, but I don't know about these ghosts. I mean, I found out later, too, from two sisters who would very often leave the group and do EVPs. And they had left the group. The spirits had told them that they were not ghosts, but they were other dimensional beings in the dungeon with us that night.
Mm.
Well, now think of it. Those spirits have been hanging around the castle for over 200 years and probably playing pranks on each other to amuse themselves.
Yeah.
So they might have been putting us on as well. I take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, what else do they have to do, right? And then finally, hey, we got another tour group in here. Time to have some fun.
Right. Yeah. So I imagine, these would have been young men, basically in their 20s. And what else do they have to do?
It is sad to think, though, that, in any of these locations, these people being stuck there and unable to, quote unquote, move on, whatever that may be.
Yeah, and you wonder why. Are they there by choice?
Right.
Are they? There's several reasons. Some, they were very religious back in those days and scared stiff of going to hell.
Yeah.
And maybe they thought they were destined and they didn't dare move on.
Well, I bet that that young lady, the blonde, she sure does have a heck of a story to tell about how a spirit was highly attracted to her and what happened after he met her. Holy cow.
Chased by a ghost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, our encounters there, too, they're not like if you're going to Wentworth Prison or those places where they're pretty horrible. I've heard stories there.
Yeah.
They're pretty benign. And, as you learn more, they talk about the vellum, or the thin places in Ireland where the spirit world and this world come together. And you know, I'm beginning to think more and more along these lines as I investigate. You know, you hear things and you kind of start thinking about it, and well, like the Spirit says, we're not of this dimension. Well, we know there are many, many dimensions, and it's quite possible that there are beings living in other dimensions simultaneous with us.
Oh, I totally believe that. And sometimes I think it's a glitch or a blip on the radar that you get to see just a little hint of something. And others, of course, have much more impactful events.
Right.
And a lot of the time it is life-changing. Even though it seems very simple and slight, it's much more than that for a lot of us.
Yeah. And I've never experienced it. I call myself an objective observer.
Mm-hmm.
I read what the experts have said, the people who've delved into it. I listen to the anecdotes, and you know, from that I think, yeah, there's more to life and death than meets the eye. You know, because we don't know. You know, people say, "Well, do you believe in ghosts?" And it's not a matter of believing.
Right.
It's what is, and it's keeping an open mind.
Absolutely. And by the way, I truly hope that you get to go on that trip to Scotland, because I want another book like this from you. I really enjoyed this book.
It's been rescheduled for June.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even it's just things are so nuts right now. It just seems like we're rolling back again. We're shutting things down again. It makes me really nervous. When we thought, oh, okay, well, we'll get a reprieve in the summer and things can get rescheduled for the fall, but I don't know. I just don't know now. So, no, I hope that Scotland trip comes quickly for you, and then you get more of the goods for another book. But guys,
yeah, I'm planning on it.
Good. No, that's only a little taste of what's in the book, Hauntings and History of the Emerald Isle. Some of the things that we didn't touch on, and this is just a few of them: the wreck of the Spanish Armada, Charles Fort and its White Lady, Duncan and Fort, and of course, the famous and infamous Hellfire Club. A lot of people are familiar with that. And, you know, there's more stories in the book that we did not touch on. But June, I want to thank you so much for coming on with me, and let everybody know where they can find your book.
Well, where can they find it? Maybe you should mention that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it is on Amazon in both ebook and paperback, and you can also find the paperback on Barnes and Noble. Well, June, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, Shannon, it was a pleasure. It's sure fun talking to you.
Well, I'm so-and-so. I was given this name by my parents. I've been to such and such a college. I've done these things in my profession. I produce a little fire. Buddha says, forget it. That's not true. That's some story. That's all gone. That's all past. I want to see the real you are now. Well, nobody knows who that is. Because we don't know ourselves except through listening to our echoes and consulting our memories. But then there's a real you, and that again leads us back to this question. Who are you? That is the real you. We shall see how they play with this exam by the koans to get you to come out of your shell and find out who you really are. divided on this. They will say, no, we don't believe literally in reincarnation. That after your funeral, you will suddenly become somebody different, living somewhere else. They will say reincarnation means this, that if you sitting here now are really convinced that you're the same person that walked in the door half an hour ago, you're being reincarnated. If you are liberated, you will understand that you're not. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. There is only the present. That's the only real you that there is. The Zen master Dogen put it in this way. He said, the spring does not become the summer. First there is summer, and then there is spring. When you settle down in the train to read your newspaper and so on, you are not the same person who a little while ago left the platform. If you think you are linking your moments up in a chain. And this is what binds you to the wheel of birth and death. But when you know that every moment in which you are is the only moment, this comes into Zen. A master will say to somebody, get up and walk across the room. And he comes back and he says, where are your footprints? They've gone. So where are you? Who are you? When we are asked who we are, we usually give a kind of recitation of a history.